Hi, welcome, Chris. Thanks so much for being here with me today and willing to be interviewed. And I'm excited that you're going to share about Stratnavapp. That's a mouthful with us, and share your insights about developing strategies for growth. But before we get started, I just wanted to give folks a little bit of background about you. You founded Stratnavapp. It's a web-based tool which assists individuals and organizations develop, share, and execute their strategic plans. Chris is an independent strategy and management consultant based in the UK. He has 26 years of experience developing strategies for growth, turnaround, and new market entry, including target operating model development and digital disruption in organizations ranging from startups to FTSE 100 firms, multinationals, which is comparable to a Fortune 500. So thanks so much for being here, Chris. And so I'm really curious, why did you develop this app? And tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, firstly, can I say thanks for setting this up, and I'm really looking forward to sharing some of this with you. It's a bit of a passion of mine, and I'm really excited just to be able to share it. I think for me, the journey started probably a couple of years ago now, where in the work I do, almost every aspect of business these days is touched by technology in some way. I do most of my work in the financial services sector, which is very technology dependent. And I realized that while I was spending most of my day helping clients to use technology to operate more effectively, serve customers more effectively, I wasn't really seeing the same benefits in my own working practices. So essentially, strategy consulting is still done largely exactly the same way it was done when I started out on this journey 26 years ago. And that is, we produce long, very thick PowerPoint stacks. They're packed with information, they're beautifully presented, but at the end of the day, it's usually a PowerPoint document based paradigm. And when you're working in a team developing strategy, really quite a lot of time is wasted emailing these large decks around, wondering who's got the latest version, dividing that pack into separate sections so people can work on it, trying to pull all the sections back together again before a big presentation, and trying to keep everything consistent and make sure everyone stays up to date. And I thought, really, this is just incredibly inefficient, and it hasn't moved. And I realized if I was working with a client, and almost whatever problem they said they had, if I said to them, I know, the solution is we'll start doing data processing with PowerPoint, that would almost certainly be the very last day.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. That would almost certainly be the very last day. I mean, I would be completely laughed at. So, and that got me thinking, how could we improve this process, and what would better look like? I guess, it started off as sort of idle speculation. What might a better solution look like? An idle speculation worked into imagining what some tools might look like. And over time, I started building components of those tools and using them in my own work. And the thing built a little bit of momentum. The more I built, the more I was able to use it in my own work, and the more value I was getting from using tools. And eventually, that sort of coalesced and evolved until about 6 to 12 months ago. I looked at what I'd done, and I thought, actually, if I just package that up a little bit more neatly, this would be something I could share with other people. and hopefully it would help them as it had helped me. And equally importantly, we could start the kind of conversations like what we're having now, and just get people talking about a better way to do strategy. And that's kind of the point at which I've arrived now. So Stratnavapp it's up and running on the web. It's a freemium-based model, software as a service. So there's no downloads or maintenance or anything. It's really easy to use, and it facilitates collaborative strategy development and, equally importantly, execution. Strategy without execution, of course, is no good to anyone. And probably the last thing to mention about where we've come with the tool now is it's based on a superset of something called Stratml, which not a lot of people have heard of, unfortunately, but Stratml is the International Standards Organization's defined standard for strategy and performance plans. So it's based on a superset of that standard, which I think gives it quite a lot of underlying robustness. So that's the story so far, and that's where we've got to today.
That's wonderful to hear about that foundation of it being based on really best practices. It's not, which I think is really key and important. So how does this app really assist your clients and to develop this strategy? And not only that, but I think you mentioned something really key is a lot of times what I've seen personally is that people develop these strategies, but they're just PowerPoints and people tuck them in their file, but how are they really moving towards their goals? Pardon me. So if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I think the starting point has got to be that best practice point, which is kind of where we ended up with just now. So clearly there is a big body of discipline that's developed around strategy formulation and execution. So it's absolutely key to build on that. There's best practice models, frameworks and processes to follow. So it's absolutely imperative that you start building on that foundation. I think one of the things I've experienced working with other people is that these days most people who get involved in strategy in one way or another are familiar with at least most of the models, perhaps not all of them, but they're at least familiar with most of the models. But where people struggle often, I find, is how you connect a thread of logic between all of the models to create a coherent plan.
Yes.
So often you'll find people are filling out the models, and they may be filling out the models quite well, but just not getting the thread of logic. So because Stratnavapp is a repository-based tool, the best practice models and frameworks that you see are really views onto an integrated database which captures the full description of the product. So built into the tool are those connections and consistency checks that make sure that the logic flows from one step of the strategy development process to another. So the kind of feedback I've had from people who've worked with the tool and experienced it is that they first looked at it and they thought, well, it's great because we have a handy template that if we just fill in the template, we'll have completed the models. But then they said what actually really brought the whole process to life for them is the way that the system connects the things together behind the scenes and helps them create that consistency. So they're not just filling out a form, they're actually building a theory, a strategic theory that's going to underline the performance of the business. So I know myself, I mean, I've been doing this for a lot of years, but I know when I build strategies using the tool now, it almost immediately becomes apparent when I have fudged something or tried to shortcut the process. The tool really highlights that and says, this doesn't all add up, and it provides the framework for saying, here's how you go and tie all of those bits together. So that's been for me, actually, as a personal learning experience, enforcing that discipline on myself has been really valuable, and it's been really satisfying to hear other people talk about how it's helped them to do the same. The other key benefit I've certainly got out of this is that one of the big criticisms that people, particularly in larger organizations, have about the way strategy is done is that strategy is often done, it's sort of an annual exercise. Often, a bunch of executives go away to an offsite somewhere,
Right.
and they come back with the tablets of stone. Here's the strategy. And there's a big reveal and a launch, and then it goes on the shelf and it gathers dust until the annual process rolls around next year, and people then pull the old strategy off the shelf, say, well, that didn't go quite as we planned, and repeat the whole process. And the fundamental problem is the minute you've finished writing a strategy document, it's out of date. Because the world changes, the business keeps growing and developing, things happen. And so one of the things I've discovered about the tool, with the live links between all of the models and frameworks, right from the initial analysis all the way through tracking the execution of the strategy, it's never a dead, out-of-date document. It's constantly evolving. And that's been a really interesting process for me, because it's quite different to what the normal experience of. It does obviously take quite a lot longer in the process for you to really start feeling the benefits of it. So I think the first thing you feel is the benefit of the way the whole thing ties together and integrates behind the scenes. But it's only when you sort of 6 months to a year into the process of executing the strategy, I think, that you start to see the benefit of that feedback loop that's built into a living model, rather than a static, dead written document, if you like. So those have been fascinating personal lessons for me, and I think things that my clients and other people have really benefited from. Well,
I truly get that connection. For me, when I've developed strategies, I've already made those connections ahead of time, but I'm using a lot of writing and pages. And then the hard piece for me is, now I have to communicate this with other folks. And so your tool really helps on that, in that piece of it, which I've noticed. So this is my I think I'm going to ask you another question after my final question, is that when you're working with clients, what do you see them challenged most about the strategy or the execution of the strategy? Is it knowing the best way to evaluate their business? I mean, how do they get stuck, and how do they move forward, and the challenges to execution, which you have hit on already?
Yeah, so the two biggest challenges I encounter are not with business strategy as a technical discipline. It's actually what I would call the more social, softer side of it. So again, if you start, I think these days you tend to be working with people who understand the strategy problem they're trying to solve. People have read books, they've done courses, etc., etc. And clearly, if you're in a situation where you're dealing with people who don't have that basic knowledge, then you have training and education a problem to solve, and you need to solve the training and education problem. But if you assume that people have the right basic level of competence, then there are really two problems that I encounter consistently in the types of organizations that I deal with. And the first one is the one I call the problem of articulation. So I think, and I think this picks up on what you're saying as well, the ability to clearly articulate a strategy is absolutely key. And a lot of what I see that gets passed off as strategy is actually incredibly high level and vague.
Yes.
And when it's often beautifully presented, and when you read it, you think this is really great. But when it comes down to execution, the saying, I was trying to work out what the right translation of the saying is. The saying we have here, it's like nailing jelly to a wall. I think you call it jello, but it's the same, right? You're trying to nail the stuff to the wall, and there's just no substance to it. It kind of crumbles as you're doing it. And this is a very real problem. And I think, over the years, my experience is there's typically two reasons for it. And one is very practically, where people haven't really got to grips with the insight they're working with. So, they've looked at the industry, they've looked at the organization, they've looked at the problem they're trying to solve. They haven't really got to the nitty-gritty, so they've made sort of high-level assumptions, and they perhaps lack, they know they've sort of not really got to grips with it, so they lack the confidence in their insights, and that sets them off from quite a woolly foundation. And the second part of the problem, and this may be a particularly British problem, we're known for being very polite here. So oftentimes when people really disagree, what they will do is, instead of facing up and working through that disagreement, they will come up with a form of wording which is artfully vague and encompasses many different viewpoints, so that everyone can feel their perspective has been heard. But they haven't really got to the bottom of the fact that they really fundamentally disagree. And this is a really poor basis for strategy. If you go back to basics, Michael Porter say, strategy is fundamentally about choices. And you have to make clear and specific choices, and you have to be clear and specific about why you're making those choices. And if you don't get that clarity, then when you get into the execution phase, the substance falls away, and basically people revert to doing whatever it was they thought they were doing before the process starts, because the process hasn't given them a solid enough foundation to do anything different. So I think that's a really fundamental problem. The problem of articulation, the ability to express your ideas as absolutely clearly and unambiguously as you can. And I hope that the way the tools are structured and strung together within Stratnavapp will really, I find it makes it harder for me to be vague and ambiguous, because the tools then find you out, because the repository in the back end it's clear that it doesn't connect up very well. And the second big problem I found is really related to basic stakeholder management. So strategy tends to be done by relatively senior, well-informed people in the industries. They tend to be very headstrong, but they also tend to have very different worldviews and experiences and disciplinary backgrounds, so they're often coming from different places. And of course, strategy almost always involves change, and quite substantial change. And change almost always creates winners and losers. Now, it may create winners, but even if it only creates winners, some people win more than others. So relatively speaking, the people who are winning less feel like they are losing. And when I say winning and losing, you can measure this in terms of power or influence or prestige, but sometimes even it comes down to straight wealth. How much people are getting paid and rewarded on these things. So it matters, the outcomes matter a lot, and the senior stakeholders in the process are heavily invested personally in the outcomes. So the strategy process that you think you're doing, which is supposed to be a rational process of analysis and prioritization and optimization, it's supposed to be a rational process about coming up to the best outcomes, is actually a power political play of people positioning for their own benefit, either directly or indirectly. And I don't mean that to sound Machiavellian. It's not like everyone's running around purely motivated by self-interest, but we're all human, and we all see the world through our different perspectives. So, so the process that you're going through is a massively power politically weighted process, and the models provide the analytical component. Stakeholder management provides the power political component, and that is why the stakeholder management component of it is embedded straight in the tool. So as you're working through the whole process, it's got the stakeholder component there to try and help you deal with that slightly more effectively. So those to me are the big challenges. I think we should all take as read that we understand the technical process of doing strategy, and if we don't, we come on courses and we study it. The big challenges are around those social factors of what makes strategy succeed or fail in the real world.
Chris, that was very thorough. I really appreciated that insight. So the last question is, what advice do you give students who are learning about strategy and one day hoping, to make a difference in their own organization, big or small?
Okay. Well, I think for me, a key driver has always been curiosity coupled with a slight disrespect for boundaries. And I think what I mean by that is, certainly when I started my working career, you get given a job, and that job is prescribed. You're responsible for achieving a certain set of outcomes. And I think why I have ended up going down the career path I ended up going down was I was always curious as to whatever job I was doing. I was curious about the bigger picture and the context about why I was doing what I was doing, what contribution I was doing made to the downstream processes, and how I could think more broadly about how to make that a success. And I think that that's a key attribute to do strategy. So career-wise, you can choose to be a technical specialist, I think, which is great. So you can pick a discipline, and you can be the single most knowledgeable person in that discipline in the world. I think to succeed in doing strategic thinking or strategic planning, you have to have the curiosity of a generalist. So I work across lots of areas. I know I'm never going to know as much as the people I'm working with about those areas, but the thing that I've always been curious and always fascinated me is how those things work together to achieve a bigger outcome.
Well, that's fantastic. That concludes the interview, and I really just would like to thank you for the information that you shared, and a lot of insight, and especially for creating this amazing app which the students are going to figure out how to use for either a fictitious company or a real company, a company that they're working for. And I'll have to report back to you how they do, and perhaps they'll be able to offer you some feedback as well. Thanks so much.
That would be great. And again, thanks for this conversation. I've really enjoyed it. I guess the last thing I'd like to say is to you and all of your students, good luck. I hope you really enjoy it as much as I've enjoyed putting it all together. And if you have any feedback, that would be absolutely most welcome. Thank you.
Thanks.